China seems determined to collapse the global economy, and it's not clear there's much that anyone can do about it. But it's not because China is going bankrupt, and not because Chinese factories are weak. The problem, as crazy as it sounds, is that China has built the strongest production system ever, and everyone is now suffering from that success, including China itself. So in this video, we're going to look at what happened here, how a historic boom is turning into a disaster for the Chinese people, how China kept doubling down, and how that overflow is hurting the rest of the world's economy. My name is Nick, and you're watching the Finance Bureau. Now, for decades, China's trajectory and its story pointed only upwards. China would get richer, Chinese households would spend more, and the world would sell into the biggest consumer market on earth. Luxury brands, car makers, miners, chip makers, farmers, everyone wanted a piece of that future. And to be fair, China did create a huge urban middle class. But the country never really fully moved from investment-led growth to household-led growth. It kept exporting and expanding production, even when domestic demand started showing signs that it was struggling. The strange part is that the Chinese government knows this imbalance is there, and it keeps promising to lift household consumption. Meanwhile, every think tank under the sun has kept warning about weak domestic demand and deflationary pressure in China. But as this pressure builds, Beijing keeps choosing to support producers, factories, local governments, and strategic sectors. And that's because these things deliver the export power and political control the government desires. And that's where the rest of the world starts getting dragged in. OECD analysis found that subsidies explained about 60% of Chinese firms' global market share gains since 2005. In other words, foreign companies are not competing against normal rivals. It's not really a fair fight. China's record 2025 trade surplus tells us that China keeps selling far more to the world than it buys back, even after the US tariffs, because exporters found new buyers and imports stayed weak. And inside China, ordinary people aren't exactly reaping the rewards of this export boom. The property market is disastrous, jobs are becoming less secure, and small businesses are already under pressure. So, China is now an economy with weak domestic demand and a real estate crisis, all while excess manufacturing and price wars feed its growing trade surplus. And that means it's not a problem isolated to China alone. Things would be fine if the country was also importing enough to balance this relationship. But a production-heavy model with weak household demand creates a simple imbalance. Other countries get the goods, and China keeps the demand problem at home. And to make things more complicated, by May 2026, it was being reported that China's new export orders were falling sharply. So now, even the production machine is running into demand limits. But the pressure doesn't vanish, it simply searches for buyers wherever it can. But before we dive deeper into the detail of all of this, if you're interested in learning about big stories like these and you want to stay on top of all of the absolute madness that is the modern world, then you should sign up for the weekly Finance Bureau newsletter. It's absolutely free, and we break down the key moves across markets, macro, politics, and more, so you don't miss what actually matters. All you have to do is click the link in the description or scan this QR code on the right of your screen. And now, back to China. Okay, so now we have an overview of the problem. But to really understand things, we need to look closer at China's property market. For many Chinese households, property became a lot more than just shelter. As in many other parts of the world, property became a form of savings and retirement planning. But it was also status and collateral. So when property takes a hit, it has serious ramifications. China's property investment dropped 17% in 2025, while home sales fell 8.7%. That's a huge hit to confidence in a market that has already been hurting for years. Chinese real estate has been grinding down since new debt controls were implemented in 2020, and things got much worse after a series of defaults, including giants like Evergrande and Country Garden in the following years. By 2025, the downturn had stretched into a multi-year confidence crisis. The country became littered with unfinished apartments. Millions of people bought apartments before they were finished and then watched the developers run off with the cash. For the average person, if the biggest purchase of your life becomes unsafe, saving then becomes absolutely critical. And this has dragged on long enough to become a central problem for everyday Chinese people. China's real estate crisis is clearly a long adjustment, not a quick correction. The country simply has too much supply and an aging population. Property also happens to feed a huge chain of normal purchases: furniture, appliances, renovation, construction materials, brokerage fees, and local services. So when housing slows, it doesn't just hurt developers. Everyday spending also gets smashed. China's limited social safety net also played a role in the weak domestic demand. People save more when the state doesn't fully protect them against just bad luck. Young people have been especially badly hit. China's youth jobless rate reached a record of over 21% before the data series just so happened to be changed in 2023. Graduates now face a weaker market after years of property stress and cautious private hiring. So, the Chinese have falling household wealth, limited welfare, weak employment, particularly among the youth, and every reason to keep saving cash. Beijing has announced plans to support services consumption, but there continues to be a major issue. For years, the system has sent more serious resources to the industrial complex rather than to households. And that dynamic doesn't just change overnight. And this is where we get the dreaded D word: deflation. When prices fall, companies cut back, profits shrink, wages get hurt, and households wait for better deals. Lower prices might sound nice for people facing inflationary pressure, but falling prices can actually lead to even worse economic damage. China is seeing this firsthand, and analysts are starting to say it's pushing the country toward a, quote, lost decade, like Japan experienced from the early 90s onwards. But in the middle of all of this, it's not as if the Chinese households are refusing to play their role. They're reacting to the incentives in front of them. And from the government's perspective, if demand is weak and confidence is fragile, the safer political choice is to keep the machines moving. And this household weakness leaves China leaning even harder on its factories. And for Beijing, manufacturing is not just GDP. It means political bargaining power and technological independence, not to mention the hard proof that China can compete with anyone. So, China has doubled down on this export growth model. Official plans are pushing something dubbed, quote, new quality productive forces. Now, what exactly does that refer to? Well, essentially, it focuses on chips, aerospace, biomedicine, future energy, quantum technology, embodied intelligence, 6G, and other key strategic industries. As you can tell from that list, the goal here is not to produce cheap shirts for everyday Western consumers. China wants to dominate the commanding heights of modern production. These are the things like EVs, batteries, solar, robotics, industrial machinery, and shipbuilding. And this is where those gargantuan subsidies come in. OECD work found industrial subsidies have reached their highest levels since the financial crisis, driven overwhelmingly by China. The support reaches Chinese businesses via grants, cheap loans, tax breaks, equity injections, and other state channels. The OECD said Chinese firms received 3 to 8 times more government support than firms in OECD countries between 2005 and 2024. From that perspective, it's kind of a miracle that industry outside of China remains competitive at all. Local governments then make the pile-up even worse. They obviously want factories because factories mean employment and fiscal revenue. So even when a sector starts getting crowded, local officials have reasons to keep backing their own champions. Letting factories fail would solve some overcapacity, but it would also create layoffs, and that results in angry creditors and embarrassed local officials. So, weak firms often stay alive long after a fair and harsher market would have forced them out. And this is why China is even exporting its factories, not just finished goods. As tariffs rise and domestic demand disappoints, Chinese manufacturers are building overseas plants and bringing their supplier networks with them into these markets. So much for distance and borders offering protection. BYD is one such example, but even it posted its first annual profit decline in 4 years, hit by price wars and softer domestic demand while overseas expansion kept going. Chinese officials have warned EV makers to stop price cutting and, quote, involution, which is basically a way of saying competition has become self-defeating. A sector can be world-class in one respect, but still be financially unhealthy. The capacity numbers are something absurd. By 2025, China's assembly lines could produce 54 million cars a year, almost double the 27.5 million made the previous year. If the plants are built to produce like that, exports are obviously crucial. China's massive solar industry has the same issue. Chinese panels are cheap and popular, but clean tech demand alone cannot absorb China's overcapacity without creating major trade tensions. Chinese solar manufacturers have been reporting losses despite being global leaders, while industry executives are calling for an end to the price war. As it turns out, dominance is not much fun when everyone is selling into a market with crushed margins. And get this, guys. By late 2025, solar capacity was large enough to meet global demand roughly twice over. That's a bit more than a little mismatch. Meanwhile, Chinese steel exports went through the roof in 2025 as domestic property demand slumped, and China still produces more than half of the world's steel and aluminium. So, China's relentless factory machine keeps running because it solves short-term problems for China's state and local governments. But this doesn't benefit the average Chinese person, as we've seen. And the issue then becomes the unavoidable fact that every extra unit has to find a buyer somewhere. When those extra units leave Chinese ports, they land in someone else's market. China's merchandise trade surplus hit a record $1.2 trillion in 2025, while exports were redirected from the US toward other markets in Europe and Asia. And speaking of Europe, it is one economy getting especially hardly hit by this. According to the European Commission, the EU-China trade and investment relationship is, quote, not sustainable, and they're preparing tougher measures to protect industries from Chinese imports. This is now being called a, quote, second China shock because it's hitting a different part of the economy. As mentioned earlier, the first wave was mostly low-cost consumer goods. This one hits autos, machinery, chemicals, green tech, industrial equipment, and high-value manufacturing. Germany, the EU's biggest economy, got hit especially hard because its whole model relied on selling premium industrial goods to the world, including China. Now, China is competing directly in cars, machinery, chemicals, and capital goods. Meanwhile, German exports to China have seriously weakened. In 2025, the EU Commission warned about, quote, potentially harmful import jumps in categories including textiles, timber, chemicals, metals, machinery, and transport equipment. That's a very wide spread. But it's not just Europe, guys. Southeast Asia faces similar pressure. Chinese exports to the region surged as US tariffs redirected those flows, and cheap Chinese products have put pressure on local manufacturers that can't compete on China's scale. Asian countries have also been dealing with their own China shock. Textiles, electronics, autos, and other industries face lower-priced Chinese imports, while factories have closed and many workers have lost their jobs. And this is why cheap imports aren't a clean win for the global south. Consumers might benefit, but local firms can get crushed before they become globally competitive. Large nations like India aren't free from this issue either. Finished steel imports from China more than doubled in April 2026, and some arrived below local prices despite existing tariffs. And the politics around steel aren't exactly isolated to Asia. The UK is challenging EU quota plans while both sides try to protect their steelmakers from cheap imports and global overcapacity. Everyone seems to agree there's pressure, but nobody seems to want to actually absorb it. Not deterred by any of this, Chinese automakers are expanding across Europe with competitive pricing and advanced EV technology. European and American brands are facing pressure in markets they used to treat as their home turf, because they were. But it's not just about the finished products. Europe is exposed to China in areas like solar energy and critical raw materials, and rebuilding independence is expensive and painfully slow. These supply relationships have left Europe vulnerable. By relying on China for too long, the EU has lost skilled technicians, process knowledge, and industrial depth. These are the things a country, or a group of countries, needs if they want to build the next product instead of importing it. As a result of this urgency, the EU is now discussing tools that go beyond tariffs. Some proposals would literally force companies in key sectors to diversify suppliers instead of relying too heavily on Chinese components. But it probably comes as no surprise that China isn't sitting on the sidelines watching this play out. It's threatened trade investigations against the EU if it moves ahead with stronger tools aimed at Chinese overcapacity. So China's domestic imbalance has now become an international political fight that's out in the open. The ECB has even warned that redirected Chinese exports could lower inflation in Europe. Although for the average EU citizen, I don't think lower inflation is necessarily a bad thing. But in any case, the political problem remains. If workers believe their industries are being sacrificed to absorb another country's excess supply, governments will not stay passive for long. They'll reach for emergency industrial plans of their own. Tariffs have been the loudest response, but they are not straightforward to fix the problem. The EU already increased tariffs on Chinese-built EVs after its anti-subsidy investigation in 2023, with duties now reaching as high as 45% in 2026. In case you somehow missed it, the US has gone much harder than that on EVs and other sectors. Washington locked in 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, plus higher tariffs on batteries, chips, steel, and other strategic goods to protect domestic industry. China's response to all of that has been to put a lot of pressure on the choke points that we referred to earlier, specifically raw materials. Rare earths go into all manner of electronics, defense systems, and advanced manufacturing. Of course, the official line from Beijing is that these export restrictions are in the name of national security. The tungsten market gives us a bit more insight into the strategic material race. Chinese buyers have been stockpiling US tungsten scrap, leading to security concerns because the metal is critical for aerospace and weapons supply chains. And if you ignore the diplomatic speeches, the US response has been to build a coalition around critical minerals. Washington has proposed a trade bloc and stockpiling strategy to weaken China's grip over inputs needed for semiconductors, EVs, and defense. But while other countries can mine some materials, China still dominates key processing and magnet-making steps, so it will still influence the global supply chain way more than everyone would like. And Beijing is also tightening its own outbound controls. New rules announced in early June 2026 expand state power on overseas deals involving Chinese investors, technology, data, restricted goods, and national security. Simply put, that makes strategic assets harder to move beyond China's reach. So, what all of this comes down to is that the world has three bad options. Accept the flood of China's overcapacity and risk hollowing out industries. Block the flood and risk higher prices and retaliation. Rebuild capacity at home, which costs a fortune and takes years. And the longer countries wait, the harder rebuilding becomes. Mines, refineries, factories, tooling, supplier contracts, and workforce skills are not created by some politician's speech near election day. This is the hard work of the real economy, and these physical things take time. Such ventures are also very expensive. Rebalancing supply chains means more expensive inputs and plenty of failed projects. But after years of dependency, governments are starting to see that initial inefficiency as the price that needs to be paid. China's broken system has been collapsing margins, jobs, supply chains, and political trust all around the world. The damage spread slowly, company by company, region by region. But now it's undeniable, and both China and the rest of the world recognize the bind they're in. China was supposed to become the world's next big consumer. Instead, it became the world's giant producer with nowhere near enough domestic demand. Foreign industries absorb the shock, while governments will continue fighting over who gets stuck cleaning up the mess. Well, that's all we have time for today, but what do you think? What should China do to get out of this funk? Is it fair for Western governments to blame China for the struggles of their own industries? Feel free to get highly opinionated in the comments down below. And if you want to balance this video with our critical look at how Europe is handling its own issues, then you can check out our video on that right over here. And that's all from me today though. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. This is Nick, signing off.